Good evening all and welcome back to Mr. Chill Chapter. Tonight we are venturing north of the border into the forgotten corners of Canada where isolation breeds secrets and small communities harbor darkness that would make even the bravest souls question their faith in humanity. 7 tales await us from across the vast Canadian wilderness, each one more disturbing than the last. Each one pulled from the shadows of towns so remote that screams echo unanswered and sins go unpunished for decades. From the mining settlements of Ontario to the coastal villages of British Columbia, we will uncover stories that prove sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings lurking in the woods, but the people living right next door. These are not mere campfire stories or urban legends passed down through generations, but real accounts from real people who lived through experiences that forever changed their understanding of evil itself. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Mr. Chill Chapter for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us step into the shadows of the Canadian wilderness where civilization ends and terror begins. Music. My name is Detective Kendrick Walsh, and in my 15 years working small-town cases across northern Ontario, I thought I had seen everything. Domestic disputes and logging camps, bar fights that turned deadly, missing persons who wandered off into the wilderness never to return. But that was all before the Jalen Morrison case landed on my desk in the bitter cold January of 2022. What I discovered during that investigation changed not only how I view human trafficking, but how these predators operate in the most remote communities where nobody is watching and nobody asks questions. I had been stationed in Timmins for 3 years when the call came in. It was a Tuesday morning and the temperature outside was hovering around 35 C. The kind of cold that makes your lungs ache just breathing the air. The call came from Martha Henley, the owner of Henley's A Light Diner, a greasy spoon restaurant that served truckers and mine workers 24 hours a day. Martha was frantic on the phone. She kept repeating that Jalen had never missed a shift, not once in the 2 years she had been working there. Jalen Morrison was 19 years old, a local girl who had graduated from a Gorman High School the year before. She lived with her grandmother in a small house on the outskirts of town, and she had been saving up money from her waitressing job to attend nursing school in Sudbury. By all accounts, she was responsible, reliable, and had her whole future mapped out ahead of her. She was supposed to work the overnight shift that Monday from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., but she never showed up. When I arrived at the diner, Martha was pacing behind the counter, her hands shaking as she poured coffee for the handful of customers who had wandered in for breakfast. She was a woman in her 60s who had run that diner for over 20 years, and she knew the routines of every regular customer and every employee like clockwork. Martha told me that Jalen had worked her usual Sunday night shift without any problems. She had seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. She had clocked out at 7:00 a.m. Monday morning, said goodbye, and walked out the front door like she always did. That was the last time anyone saw her. I drove straight to Jalen's grandmother's house, a small bungalow with peeling paint and a snow-covered garden that had not been tended to in years. Eleanor Morrison was 82 years old and had raised Jalen since she was 7. After Jalen's mother died in a car accident, Eleanor was sitting in her living room when I knocked, wrapped in a thick blanket and clutching a cup of tea with trembling hands. She told me that Jalen had come home Monday morning after work, eaten some breakfast, and gone to bed around 9:00 a.m., like she always did after working the night shift. Eleanor had woken up Monday evening around 6 p.m. and had expected to find Jalen getting ready for work. But Jalen's bed was empty and her work uniform was still hanging in the closet. Her purse was gone along with her winter coat and boots, but everything else was exactly as she had left it. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall beside her bed. Her laptop was open on her desk with a half-finished nursing school application still on the screen. I spent the next 2 days canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing everyone who might have seen Jalen. Tiemens is not a large town, and word travels fast when someone goes missing, but nobody had seen her leave the house Monday evening. Nobody had seen her walking along the roads. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. On Thursday morning, I decided to review the security footage from the diner. Martha had mentioned that they had recently installed a new camera system after a series of break-ins at businesses around town. The cameras covered the parking lot, the front entrance, and the interior of the restaurant. I spent hours going through the footage from Sunday night and Monday morning watching Jalen serve customers, clean tables, and go about her normal routine. But it was the footage from Monday evening that changed everything. At 8:47 p.m. Monday night, more than 12 hours after Jalen had supposedly gone home and gone to bed, the security camera clearly showed her walking through the front door of the diner. She was not wearing her work uniform. Instead, she was dressed in jeans and a heavy winter coat, and she looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. She approached the counter where Martha was working and spoke to her for approximately 2 minutes. Then she turned around and walked back toward the entrance. But she was not alone. A man had been sitting in one of the corner booths, partially obscured by shadows, and he stood up and followed her to the door. He was tall, probably in his 40s, with dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a heavy winter jacket and work boots, the kind of clothes that would blend in perfectly among the truckers and construction workers who frequented the diner. The footage showed him placing his hand on Jalen's back as they walked outside together. I immediately called Martha and asked her about the Monday evening visit. At first she seemed confused, saying that Jalen had not been scheduled to work that night and had not come in. But when I pressed her about it, her voice became hesitant. Finally, she admitted that Jalen had come in around 8:30 p.m., but she had seemed upset about something. Jalen had asked if she could use the phone because her cell phone was dead and she needed to call someone. Martha had let her use the phone behind the counter, and afterward Jalen had thanked her and left. Martha claimed she had not noticed the man who followed Jalen out, but something in her voice told me she was not telling the whole truth. I pulled the security footage from several businesses along the main road leading out of town, hoping to track the direction Jalen and the unknown man had gone. Most of the cameras were old and the footage was grainy, but I managed to piece together their route. They had walked together to a dark-colored pickup truck parked behind the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away from the diner. The license plate was not visible in any of the footage, and the truck was a common make and model that could belong to any one of hundreds of people in the area. That was where the trail went cold. I contacted the Ontario Provincial Police and requested assistance with what was now clearly a potential abduction case. Detective Sarah Chen from the OP's Human Trafficking Unit arrived in Tiemens 2 days later, and she brought with her a different perspective on what might have happened to Jalen Morrison. Detective Chen explained that Northern Ontario had become a corridor for human trafficking operations precisely because of its remote location and transient population. Mining companies, logging operations, and trucking routes brought in workers from all over the country, many of whom had no permanent address and no family connections in the area. It was the perfect environment for criminals to operate without attracting attention from law enforcement. She told me that trafficking rings often used local businesses as fronts for their operations. Restaurants, motel, and truck stops provided convenient meeting places where victims could be transferred from one handler to another without arousing suspicion. The perpetrators would often spend weeks or months building relationships with potential victims, gaining their trust before making their move. We returned to the diner and questioned Martha more thoroughly. This time, Detective Chen took the lead, and her approach was more direct. She explained to Martha that we believed Jalen had been trafficked. and that anyone who had helped facilitate the crime could face serious criminal charges. She also explained that Martha might be in danger herself if she had witnessed something that could identify the perpetrators. That was when Martha finally broke down and told us the truth. The man who had followed Jalen out of the diner was not a stranger. His name was Rick Dalton, and he had been coming to the diner regularly for about 6 months. He claimed to work in construction, traveling between job sites across northern Ontario. He was friendly, polite, and he always left generous tips. He had gradually started conversations with Jalen, asking about her plans for nursing school and offering to help her with tuition costs. Martha said that Rick had told Jalen he knew people who could get her a much better paying job than waitressing, working as a hostess at high-end restaurants in Toronto and Montreal. The work would pay enough that she could save up for school much faster than she could working at the diner. He had given her his phone number and told her to call him if she was interested. On Monday evening, Jalen had come to the diner upset because she had called Rick, but her grandmother's phone was not working properly. She needed to use the diner's phone to call him back because she had decided to accept his job offer. She was supposed to meet him that night to discuss the details. Martha said she had a bad feeling about the whole situation, but she had not wanted to interfere in Jalen's decisions. She was young and eager to improve her circumstances, and Martha understood that the opportunities for good-paying work in Timmins were limited. Armed with Rick Dalton's name, Detective Chen was able to access databases that I did not have clearance for. Within hours, we discovered that Rick Dalton was an alias. The man's real name was Richard Dalkowski, and he had been arrested twice in Manitoba on charges related to human trafficking. Though both cases had been dropped due to lack of evidence, he had known associates in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia who were suspected of involvement in trafficking operations. More importantly, Detective Chen's contacts were able to trace cell phone records that showed Rick had been in regular contact with several phone numbers registered to addresses in Toronto and Montreal. The pattern of calls suggested that he was coordinating with other members of a trafficking network, reporting on potential victims and arranging transfers. We now had enough evidence to obtain search warrants and begin a coordinated operation with law enforcement agencies in multiple provinces, but time was critical. Detective Chen explained that trafficking victims were usually moved quickly and frequently to prevent them from forming connections or learning enough about their location to escape. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Rick's phone contacts led us to a trucking company based in Sudbury that was suspected of transporting trafficking victims along Highway 11 between northern Ontario and southern Ontario cities. When OP officers executed a search warrant on the company's offices, they found detailed logs of routes, pickup points, and drop-off locations. One of those locations was an abandoned mining facility 30 kilometers outside of Timmins. The mine had been closed for over a decade, but the underground tunnels were still intact. Local authorities had sealed most of the entrances years ago, but Detective Chen suspected that traffickers might have found ways to access the underground areas where victims could be held without any possibility of being seen or heard. On a Friday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Jalen had first gone missing, a joint task force of OP officers, RCMP personnel, and local emergency responders descended on the abandoned mine site. They brought specialized equipment for underground rescue operations and thermal imaging devices that could detect human body heat through rock and concrete. It took nearly 6 hours of searching, but they found her. Jalen was alive but barely conscious in a makeshift holding area deep underground. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from hypothermia. But she was breathing. She had been chained to a support beam in what had once been an equipment storage room. There was evidence that other people had been held in the same location recently. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her condition before transporting her to the hospital in Timmins. For the first 48 hours, doctors were not certain she would survive, But Jalen Morrison was stronger than anyone realized when she was finally able to speak. She told us that Rick had driven her to what he claimed was a job interview at a restaurant in Sudbury. But instead of stopping at a restaurant, he had brought her to an isolated house where 3 other men were waiting. They had drugged her, and when she woke up, she was in the underground room at the mine site. She had been told that she was going to be transported to Toronto, where she would be forced to work in the sex trade until she had paid off a debt that they claimed she owed for room, board, and transportation costs. The debt was designed to be impossible to repay, ensuring that she would remain trapped indefinitely. Rick and 2 of his associates were arrested and charged with human trafficking, forcible confinement, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed that they had been operating in northern Ontario for at least 2 years, targeting young women from small towns who were looking for opportunities to improve their economic situations. During the trial, we learned that Jalen had not been their only victim. The network had successfully trafficked at least 12 other young women from communities across northern Ontario and Manitoba. Most of those victims were never found. Jalen Morrison recovered from her physical injuries, but the psychological trauma of her experience will stay with her for the rest of her life. She was never able to attend nursing school as she had planned. The trust that had been broken could never be fully repaired. But she survived, and her case helped law enforcement agencies across Canada better understand how these trafficking networks operate in remote communities. As for Rick Dalton or Richard Dalkowski, he was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. But Detective Chen warned me that trafficking networks are like hydras. Cut off one head and 2 more appear to take its place. The demand for victims ensures that there will always be predators ready to exploit the vulnerable, especially in isolated communities where they can operate in shadows. The Jalen Morrison case taught me that evil does not always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it looks like a friendly customer who leaves generous tips and asks polite questions about your future plans. Sometimes it wears a helpful smile and offers opportunities that seem too good to be true. And sometimes it operates in plain sight in the places where we should feel safest, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I am Dalen Kowalski, 3rd-generation farmer, and what happened on our property during the winter of 2019 made me question everything I thought I knew about the land. And my family has worked for 60 years. My grandfather bought this 800-acre farm outside Dawson Creek, British Columbia back in 1959 when the oil boom was just beginning and land was still cheap. My father expanded the operation in the 80s, and when I inherited it in 2015, I thought I understood every hill, every creek, every stand of trees on the property better than I understood my own reflection. I was wrong. The first sign something was not right came in late November, just after the first heavy snowfall of the season. I had gone out early that morning to check on the cattle in the north pasture the way I did every morning during winter months. The temperature had dropped to -20 overnight, and I wanted to make sure the water troughs had not frozen solid. It was still dark when I reached the pasture, with only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. What I found there defied every bit of farming experience I had accumulated over 34 years of life. 7 of my Black Angus cattle were dead. Not sick, not injured, but completely dead, lying in the snow in what appeared to be a perfect circle around the water trough. Each animal was positioned exactly the same way, lying on their left side with their heads pointing toward the center of the circle and their legs extended straight out from their bodies. There were no signs of struggle, no blood in the snow, no tracks from predators or vehicles. I had raised cattle my entire adult life, and I had seen animals die from disease, injury, predator attacks, and severe weather. But I had never seen anything like this. Healthy adult cattle weighing over 1,000 pounds each do not simply lie down in geometric patterns and die simultaneously for no apparent reason. I called our veterinarian, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had been treating our animals for over a decade. She arrived within an hour, and I could see the confusion in her face as she examined the carcasses. She took tissue samples, photographed the scene, and checked the remaining cattle for signs of illness or poisoning. All of the other animals appeared to be in perfect health. Dr. Martinez sent the tissue samples to a laboratory in Calgary for analysis. The results came back 2 weeks later, and they provided no answers, no traces of poison, no evidence of disease, no indication of what might have caused the deaths. According to every test the laboratory could perform, the cattle had simply stopped living. But that was only the beginning. 3 nights later, my wife Sarah woke me around 2 in the morning, shaking my shoulder and whispering that there were lights in the north pasture. I looked out our bedroom window, and sure enough, there were strange lights moving slowly across the field where I had found the dead cattle. They were not the headlights of a vehicle or the beam of a flashlight. These lights had a pale blue-white glow, and they seemed to hover about 3 feet above the ground, moving in random patterns like they were searching for something. Where I grabbed my rifle and my heaviest winter coat and went outside to investigate. Sarah begged me not to go alone, but I told her to stay in the house with our 2 children and call the RCMP if I was not back within an hour. The temperature outside was brutal, probably close to -30, and the wind was cutting across the open fields like a knife. As I walked toward the north pasture, the lights suddenly stopped moving and began to fade. By the time I reached the fence line, they had disappeared completely. But something else was wrong with the scene. The snow in the pasture was not smooth like it should have been after days of wind. Instead, there were patterns pressed into the snow, geometric shapes that looked almost like symbols or writing in a language I did not recognize. The patterns covered an area about 50 feet in diameter, centered on the spot where I had found the dead cattle. The impressions in the snow were perfectly formed with clean edges and uniform depth. Whatever had created them had to have been heavy enough to compress the snow. But I could not find any tracks leading to or away from the area. I took photographs with my phone and returned to the house, but I did not sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning I drove back out to the pasture to examine the patterns in daylight. But the snow had been swept clean by the wind, and there was no trace of the strange symbols. Over the next 2 weeks, the lights appeared 4 more times, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always in the same general area. Each time I tried to get close enough to see what was causing them, but they would vanish as soon as I approached. Sarah started sleeping poorly, jumping at every sound outside and insisting that something was watching the house from the tree line that bordered our property to the east. Then on the night of December 15th, everything changed. I was awakened not by Sarah, but by a sound I had never heard before. It was coming from outside somewhere near the barn, and it was unlike anything I could describe. Imagine the sound of wind blowing through a tunnel, but with an underlying rhythm like a heartbeat and occasional sharp notes that sounded almost like screaming. The sound was so unsettling that it made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing in our yard about 30 feet from the house. The figure was tall, probably close to 7 feet, and unnaturally thin. Even at a distance and in the darkness, I could tell that its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, and its head seemed too small for its body. It was facing the house, and although I could not make out any details of its face, I had the overwhelming sensation that it was looking directly at me. The figure stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then it turned and began walking toward the tree line with a strange, shambling gait that looked more like it was floating just above the ground than actually taking steps. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight and ran outside, shouting at the figure to stop and identify itself. But by the time I reached the spot where it had been standing, it had vanished into the trees. I followed its tracks in the snow, but after about 20 ft, the tracks simply ended. There were no prints leading deeper into the woods, no broken branches, no sign of where the figure might have gone. But there was something else in the snow where the tracks ended. It was the carcass of a deer, but like the cattle, it showed no signs of injury or disease. The deer was lying on its side in the same position as the dead cattle had been, with its head pointing toward the house and its legs extended straight out from its body. But this deer had been dead for much longer than the few minutes since I'd seen the figure. The carcass was frozen solid and partially covered with snow, indicating it had been there for days. The next morning, I called the RCMP detachment in Dawson Creek and reported the incidents. Constable David Thompson arrived that afternoon to take a statement and examine the evidence. He was professional and thorough, but I could tell he was skeptical about my account of the tall figure and the strange lights. However, his attitude changed when I showed him the deer carcass and the photographs I had taken of the dead cattle. Constable Thompson had grown up in the area and had hunting and farming experience. He knew that the positioning of the animals was not natural, and he could not explain how 7 healthy cattle could die simultaneously without any apparent cause. He suggested that I contact Dr. James White, an elder from the local Danza First Nation, who might have traditional knowledge that could help explain what was happening on my land. Constable Thompson explained that the Danza people had lived in the Peace River region for thousands of years, and they had knowledge of the land that went back generations before European settlement. I was skeptical about seeking help from traditional indigenous sources, but I was desperate enough to try anything. Dr. Whitehorse agreed to meet with me the following day, and when I described the events on my property, his expression grew increasingly serious. He told me that my farm was located on land that the Danza people considered to be spiritually significant. According to their oral traditions, the area had once been the site of a winter camp, where a terrible tragedy had occurred sometime in the distant past. A group of families had been trapped there during an especially harsh winter, and they had all starved to death when game became scarce and their food stores ran out. Dr. Whitehorse explained that in Danza tradition, people who died of starvation under such circumstances could become Wendigo, cannibalistic spirits that were forever hungry and could never find peace. These spirits were said to roam the land where they died, searching for sustenance and growing stronger with each life they took. He told me that the geometric patterns I had seen in the snow were consistent with traditional descriptions of window markings, and that the tall, unnaturally thin figure I had encountered matched traditional descriptions of these spirits. The fact that animals were dying without apparent cause suggested that the Wendigo was feeding on their life force, growing stronger and bolder with each kill. Dr. Whitehorse warned me that if the window was indeed active on my land, it would not be satisfied with taking only animal lives indefinitely. As it grew stronger, it would begin to target human beings, starting with those who lived closest to its territory. He offered to perform a traditional cleansing ceremony on my property, but he cautioned that such ceremonies were not always successful, especially if the window had already become very powerful. He also warned me that the ceremony might anger the spirit and cause it to become more aggressive before it was banished. I was torn between my rational skepticism and my growing fear for my family's safety. The scientific part of my mind rejected the idea of supernatural spirits, but I could not explain what was happening on my property through any conventional means, and the incidents were becoming more frequent and more disturbing. The decision was made for me 2 nights later. Sarah woke me around 3 a.m., frantically shaking me and pointing toward our children's bedroom. She whispered that she had heard someone walking around upstairs in the hallway, outside the kids' rooms. But both of our children were sound sleepers, and neither of them was in the habit of getting up in the middle of the night. I grabbed my rifle and crept upstairs as quietly as I could. The hallway was dark, but I could see that both children's bedroom doors were open. They were both supposed to be closed. I looked into my daughter Emma's room first, and she was sleeping peacefully in her bed, undisturbed. But when I looked into my son Tyler's room, my blood ran cold. Tyler was sitting up in his bed, wide awake, staring at his bedroom window. He was not moving, not blinking, just staring with an expression I had never seen on his 8-year-old face before. When I whispered his name, he did not respond or even acknowledge my presence. I followed his gaze to the window, and there, standing outside in our backyard, was the tall figure I had seen before. But this time it was much closer, only about 10 ft from the house, and I could see more details. Its skin was grayish-white, stretched tight over bones that seemed to be jutting out at unnatural angles. Its face was gaunt and hollow, with sunken cheeks and eyes that glowed with a pale blue light. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp. The figure was looking directly at Tyler, and Tyler was looking back, neither of them moving or making any sound. I raised my rifle and aimed it at the figure. But before I could fire, it opened its mouth wider and let out a sound that was part shriek, part growl, and part something I could not even describe. The sound was so loud and so alien that it seemed to vibrate through my bones. Tyler immediately fell back onto his bed unconscious, and the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. I ran to Tyler and checked his pulse and breathing. He was alive, but his skin was cold to the touch, and I could not wake him up no matter how hard I tried. Sarah called for an ambulance, and we rushed him to the hospital in Dawson Creek. The doctors could not find anything wrong with Tyler. His vital signs were normal. His blood tests came back clean, and there were no signs of injury or illness, but he remained unconscious for 3 days. And when he finally woke up, he had no memory of what had happened that night. However, something had changed in Tyler. He had lost weight during those 3 days, even though he had been receiving IV nutrition at the hospital. His hair had developed streaks of gray that had not been there before. And his eyes, which had always been brown like mine, now had flecks of pale blue in them. That was when I knew that Dr. Whitehorse had been right. Whatever was on my land was not natural, and it was getting stronger. I called Dr. Whitehorse the next day and agreed to the traditional cleansing ceremony. He arrived the following evening with 2 other elders from his community, and they spent the entire night performing rituals around my property. They burned sage and sweetgrass, sang traditional songs, and conducted ceremonies in the Danza language that I could not understand. The ceremony seemed to work. The strange lights never appeared again, and I never saw the tall figure after that night. The remaining cattle stayed healthy, and no more animals died under mysterious circumstances. But the peace came at a cost. Tyler never fully recovered from his encounter with the Wendigo. He grew up to be a quiet, withdrawn child who avoided spending time outdoors and refused to talk about what had happened that winter. And sometimes when the light hit his eyes just right, I could still see those flecks of pale blue that served as a permanent reminder of the night something inhuman had tried to claim my son's soul. I still work the land that has been in my family for 3 generations, but I no longer take its history for granted. There are forces in this world that science cannot explain and that skepticism cannot defeat. And sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to acknowledge that there are things beyond your understanding and seek help from those who carry the wisdom of generations. Music. My name is Indiana Santos, and I am a professional sound engineer who moved to Lillooet, British Columbia in the spring of 2021 for the peace and quiet. After spending 15 years working in recording studios in Vancouver, mixing albums for rock bands and scoring soundtracks for television shows, I was completely burned out on the noise and chaos of city life. What I recorded instead during my first year in this tiny mountain town will haunt me for the rest of my life. Lillooet sits in the Fraser Canyon about 250 kilometers northeast of Vancouver, and it is one of those places where the mountains seem to swallow sound rather than echo it. The town has a population of just over 2,000 people, and most of them have lived there for generations. It was exactly the kind of isolated, quiet environment I needed to reset my career and maybe start working on some personal projects I had been putting off for years. I bought a small house on the outskirts of town, right where the residential area gives way to the wilderness that stretches north toward the Caribou Mountains. The house came with a detached garage that was perfect for converting into a home recording studio. I spent my first 3 months there installing professional-grade acoustic insulation, setting up my mixing board and monitors, and calibrating my equipment to capture the purest possible sound quality. By August, my studio was operational, and I was ready to begin work on an ambient music album that would incorporate natural sounds from the British Columbia wilderness. My plan was to record hours of environmental audio during different seasons and weather conditions, then layer those recordings with synthesized music to create something that would capture the feeling of being alone in the mountains. I started by setting up remote recording equipment in various locations around my property and the surrounding forest. I had several high-end field recorders that could operate for weeks on battery power, capturing 24 hours of audio per day with minimal human intervention. I positioned them near Talon Creek, which ran behind my property, in clearings where I thought I might capture interesting bird songs or wind patterns, and in deeper parts of the forest where I hoped to record the subtle sounds of wildlife moving through the underbrush. The first few weeks of recordings were exactly what I had expected. Hours of flowing water, wind through pine trees, the occasional call of a lawn or the rustle of small animals moving through the forest. I was getting beautiful, clean audio that would work perfectly for the ambient project I had in mind. But in early September, something changed. I was reviewing the previous night's recordings from the device I had positioned near Talon Creek when I noticed something unusual in the audio file. It was around 3:27 in the morning during what should have been the quietest part of the night when I heard what sounded like human voices having a conversation about 50 ft away from the microphone. At first, I assumed it was late-night hikers or maybe local teenagers who had been drinking by the creek, but as I listened more carefully with my professional headphones, I realized that the voices were not speaking English. In fact, they were not speaking any language I could identify, and I had worked with musicians and vocalists from dozens of different countries over the years. The conversation lasted for approximately 7 minutes, and it involved at least 3 distinct voices, all of them male. The tone was serious, almost formal, like they were discussing something important, but the language itself was completely foreign to me. The phonetic patterns did not match any European, Asian, or indigenous languages I had ever heard, and some of the sounds seemed to involve vocal techniques that I was not sure human throats could produce. I made a digital copy of the audio segment and played it for several people in town, hoping someone might recognize the language or at least have an explanation for who might have been out by the creek in the middle of the night. But nobody I spoke with had any idea what the voices were saying or where they might have come from. I decided to continue monitoring the recordings more carefully, and over the next 2 weeks I captured similar conversations on 3 more occasions. Each time the voices appeared between 2 and 4 a.m., always near the creek and always speaking in the same unidentifiable language. The conversations were becoming longer and more frequent, and I was beginning to worry that my property was being used for some kind of illegal activity. But then I recorded something that made me question whether the voices were human at all. On the night of September 23rd, my equipment captured what sounded like the same three voices having another conversation near the creek. But this time, one of the voices began describing events that I recognized. In the strange, impossible language, the voice was providing what sounded like a detailed account of my daily activities from the previous week. I know this sounds insane, but I am certain that the voice was talking about me. It described how I had driven into town on Monday to buy groceries, mentioning specific items I had purchased and the order in which I had visited different stores. It described the phone conversation I had with my former business partner in Vancouver on Tuesday evening, including details that no one else could have known, unless they had been listening to both sides of the call. Most disturbing of all, the voice described private moments inside my house that no outside observer could have witnessed. It knew that I had been having trouble sleeping and had been taking melatonin tablets before bed. It knew that I had been working on a piece of music that incorporated recordings of thunderstorms. It somehow knew intimate details about my life that I had not shared with anyone. The other two voices responded to this information with what sounded like approval and encouragement, as if they were receiving a report from someone who had been assigned to watch me. I started staying up late and keeping watch on the creek area, hoping to catch whoever was conducting surveillance on my property, but I never saw anyone, and the voices never appeared when I was actively listening for them. They only showed up on the recordings when I was asleep in my house, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening outside. Then in early October, the recordings took an even more disturbing turn. The voices began describing events that had not happened yet, but which came true within days of being recorded. On October 5th, I recorded a conversation in which one of the voices described a car accident that would occur on Highway 99 just south of Lillooet, involving a blue pickup truck and a logging truck. The voice provided specific details about the time of day, the weather conditions, and the injuries that would result from the crash. 3 days later, exactly as described in the recording, a blue pickup truck collided with a logging truck on Highway 99 during an afternoon rainstorm. The driver of the pickup truck suffered the exact injuries that had been predicted in the mysterious conversation, and the accident occurred at precisely the time that had been mentioned. I contacted the RCMP detachment in Lillooet and tried to explain what I had recorded. But I could tell that Constable Michael Peterson thought I was either mentally unstable or trying to perpetrate some kind of hoax. He listened to the audio files I played for him, but he dismissed them as coincidence or suggested that I might have misunderstood what the voices were actually saying. But I kept recording, and the predictions kept coming true. On October 12th, the voices described a house fire that would occur on 1st Avenue, providing details about which room the fire would start in and how the occupants would escape. 2 days later, the Henderson family's house on Marnard Avenue caught fire in their kitchen, exactly as the voices had predicted, and the family escaped through their bedroom window just as the recording had described. On October 19th, the voices predicted that Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who ran the local library, would fall and break her hip while walking her dog near the community center. They specified that it would happen on a Tuesday morning around 9:30 a.m., that her dog would run home to alert her daughter, and that she would be hospitalized for 6 weeks. The following Tuesday, Margaret Chen fell and broke her hip while walking her dog near the community center at 9:28 a.m. Her dog ran home and led her daughter back to where Margaret was lying injured. She was hospitalized for exactly 6 weeks. I was terrified, but I was also fascinated from a scientific perspective. As a sound engineer, I was trained to analyze audio objectively and identify any signs of manipulation or fakery. But these recordings were completely authentic. The voices were being captured live in real time with no evidence of digital editing or post-production enhancement. I began researching similar phenomena online and discovered that there have been reports throughout history of people recording mysterious voices that seem to possess knowledge of future events. These cases are often dismissed as hoaxes or psychological delusions, but the technical quality of my recordings made it impossible for me to doubt what I was hearing. I also learned that Lillooet sits in an area that has significant geological and electromagnetic properties. The town is located at the confluence of two major river systems surrounded by mountains that contain high concentrations of quartz and other crystalline minerals. Some researchers have theorized that certain geographical locations can act as natural amplifiers for paranormal phenomena, though mainstream science rejects these theories. In late October, I made a decision that would change the entire nature of my situation.